The demographic time bomb, the irreversible collapse of productive nations. There is a force more powerful than armies, market cycles, or political ideologies that is currently rewriting the global order. It is an unseen, mathematically irreversible pattern of demographic collapse. This isn't a theory. It is a population certainty that guarantees the inevitable economic decline of the world's most productive and successful nations, Japan, Germany, and China. For 3 decades, the global economic narrative has been dominated by the growth models of the Asian powerhouses and the European engine. Now, the silent killer that their own success created, plunging birth rates, has matured. The workforce is shrinking, the consumer base is aging, and the social contracts of their welfare states are turning into financial black holes. This is the story of the demographic death spiral, the irreversible economic pattern that dictates why the decline of these 3 giants is a mathematical certainty, and why their collapse will fundamentally guarantee a new, chaotic world order built on labor scarcity and fiscal impossibility. We will analyze the 4-stage pattern of demographic collapse and show you why these nations are already trapped in stage 3 with no viable escape. Chapter 1. The demographic death spiral, a mathematical certainty. The strength of any nation's economy is ultimately determined by its demographics, the size, health, and age structure of its population. Birth rates are the primary engine of a modern economy. They dictate the size of the future workforce, the health of the consumer base, and the viability of pay-as-you-go retirement systems. The replacement rate of 2.1 is critical because it ensures that one generation is exactly replaced by the next, maintaining a stable population size. When nations drop below this rate for decades, the demographic structure inverts, creating a reverse pyramid where the elderly population relies on a shrinking base of young workers. This inversion is the demographic death spiral, the 4-stage pattern of demographic collapse. Every nation that achieves advanced economic development and high female education follows a predictable, irreversible sequence once fertility falls below 2.1. Japan, Germany, and China are currently caught in stages 3 and 4. Stage 1, the peak and fall. This stage is characterized by the fertility rate dropping rapidly below 2.1, but the workforce, aged 25-54, is still large. The economic impact is high productivity and high GDP growth, known as the demographic dividend. Stage 2, the lag and illusion. Fertility stabilizes at a low level, typically between 1.5 and 1.8. The total population size is still rising due to demographic momentum, the large earlier generation having children. Strong economic performance masks the future workforce shortage, creating the illusion of sustainability. Stage 3, the contraction. Fertility is critically low, often near 1.3 to 1.5. The total population begins to shrink, and most critically, the workforce aged 20-59 enters irreversible decline. The economic consequences include labor scarcity, wage inflation, manufacturing exodus, and the onset of severe fiscal strain. Stage 4, the debt spiral. Fertility is at its lowest point, typically between 1.0 and 1.3. The dependency ratio, elderly reliance on workers, spikes dramatically. The fiscal cost of the elderly becomes mathematically impossible to fund via tax revenue alone, leading to permanent economic stagnation, Japan style, and massive sovereign debt accumulation, signifying systemic social contract failure. Japan, the ghost in the global economy. Japan is not just the most advanced case study of this collapse, it is the ghost of the future haunting every low-fertility nation. Japan entered stage 3 in the early 1990s and has been locked in stage 4 since the early 2010s. Japan's current fertility rate hovers dangerously low, around 1.3. Its total population has been shrinking for well over a decade. This sustained low birth rate has resulted in an enormous workforce cliff. Since 1995, Japan's working age population, 1564, has dropped from 87 million to around 74 million. This loss of over 13 million productive workers is the primary structural reason for 3 decades of economic stagnation and near zero GDP growth. You cannot generate GDP growth by losing workers at that scale. The most severe outcome is the dependency ratio crisis. Japan now has one of the highest old age dependency ratios in the world. By 2040, it is projected that one working age person will be required to support one elderly person. This demographic burden means that taxes and Social Security contributions must effectively double to maintain the current level of elder support, a political and fiscal impossibility that no democratic nation can sustain. The economic consequence of this is known as Japanification, which proves the rule. Demographic collapse guarantees secular stagnation. The lack of young consumers kills domestic demand, and the scarcity of workers kills supply. The result is chronic deflationary pressure, permanently zero interest rates, and the world's largest sovereign debt burden, over 260% of GDP. This debt is not accidental. It is the inevitable fiscal response to a shrinking taxpayer base forced to support a rapidly growing pensioner class. Japan's failure to escape the spiral, despite decades of policy effort, technological genius, and unparalleled national cohesion, proves that once a nation enters stage 3, the pattern is irreversible without immediate, massive, and politically infeasible immigration or fertility intervention. Germany, the aging engine of Europe. Germany is the economic powerhouse of Europe, the manufacturing engine that provides fiscal stability to the Eurozone. But its demographic structure is a ticking time bomb under the continent's foundation. Germany is deep into stage 3. Germany's fertility rate has been consistently low for decades, currently around 1.5. This decline began in the 1970s and has resulted in an age structure that is among the oldest globally. The consequences for its industrial base are imminent. By 2035, Germany's working-age population is projected to shrink by over 8 million people. This is equivalent to losing the entire current workforce of Bavaria and Berlin combined. As the workforce collapses, so does its capacity to sustain its high-value manufacturing sector. Automobiles, precision machinery, which relies heavily on skilled labor. The fiscal implosion in Germany is unavoidable. Germany's generous social security and gold standard healthcare systems are predicated on a stable workforce. The current pension system is already stressed. As the number of pensioners spikes and the tax base shrinks, Germany faces an inevitable choice: massive tax hikes that crush economic competitiveness, or severe cuts to pensions and welfare that destroy social cohesion. Neither option is politically viable in a democracy. Germany's proactive attempts to use mass migration have provided temporary relief, but have not solved the structural problem. Integration challenges, coupled with the sheer scale of the demographic deficit, mean migration can only slow the decline, not reverse it. The economic foundation of the Eurozone is set to crack. The inevitable decline of German productivity and solvency will send shockwaves through the entire Eurozone, turning the region into a fiscal patient mirroring Japan, but with the added complication of multiple interconnected sovereign debts and a shared precarious currency. Chapter 2. China's self-inflicted wound. The coming Great Contraction. China, as economic miracle, was predicated entirely on the demographic dividend created by the sheer size of its population and its notorious one-child policy. Now, the economic cost of that policy is arriving with brutal, compressed force. China is facing the most rapid and severe demographic contraction in human history, plunging headlong from stage 2 into a critical, irreversible stage 3, the one-child hangover, decades of disaster. The one-child policy, 1979 to 2016, was not merely a social policy. It was the single most destructive economic decision of the 20th century. It created the perfect demographic storm for several reasons. First, the policy artificially compressed a generational shift, ensuring the dividend would be spent quickly. Second, it created a severe gender imbalance, reducing the marriageable population. Most importantly, it completely destroyed the cultural preference for large families. The policy's lingering effects mean that China's fertility rate has plummeted to a shockingly low level, estimated to be around 1.1 to 1.2. This rate is far below the replacement rate of 2.1 and puts it among the lowest in the world, below both Japan and Germany. China enjoyed its demographic dividend from 1980 to 2010, relying on the massive cohort born before the one-child policy. That dividend has now been spent, and the structural cost is now being paid. China's total population began shrinking in 2022 for the first time since the Great Famine in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The most critical impact is the workforce decline. The working-age population is already shrinking rapidly and is projected to lose over 200 million workers by 2050. This is equivalent to erasing the entire current population of Pakistan from China as labor force over the next 25 years. You cannot sustain the world's manufacturing engine, the foundation of China's economic and political power, while losing productive workers at this unimaginable scale. The Great Contraction, the economic nightmare. China's demographic future guarantees a profound and sustained economic crisis that will dwarf its ongoing real estate debt issues and local government fiscal woes. This crisis will manifest in simultaneous supply and demand shocks. 1. Manufacturing exodus, the supply shock. China's decades-long advantage of cheap, abundant labor is effectively over. As the workforce shrinks, wages are forced upward due to scarcity, making Chinese manufacturing far less competitive against younger nations like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Mexico. This scarcity is already driving foreign and domestic companies to rapidly relocate production, a process known as decoupling or friendshoring, rapidly shrinking China's dominant and essential role in global supply chains. 2. Consumer demand collapse, the demand shock. An aging population is structurally incapable of serving as a growing consumer base. Elderly people consume less, prioritize savings and security, and avoid risk. As the consumer base shrinks, the domestic demand needed to offset the manufacturing slowdown will vanish. The long-stated goal of the Communist Party to transition to a consumption-led economy becomes demographically impossible when the cohort of prime consumers is shrinking. 3. The pension system failure. China's state-run pension system is severely underfunded, relying heavily on provincial tax revenue that is now collapsing due to the real estate crisis. By 2035, the National Pension Fund is projected to run out of money. With a vast, rapidly aging population and a shrinking youth cohort, the 4-2-1 problem, where one child must support 2 parents and 4 grandparents, the social cost of elderly care will crush state finances. This financial insolvency will lead to either an unprecedented fiscal commitment that bankrupts the central government or widespread social unrest among the elderly population whose expected security is withdrawn. The geopolitical time constraint. China's demographic crisis is not just an economic problem. It is the primary constraint on its geopolitical ambitions, particularly regarding the United States and global power parity. The window of opportunity for China to achieve its goal of global technological and military parity and to resolve the Taiwan question through force or coercion is rapidly closing. The economic vitality necessary to fund a permanent global military presence, project overwhelming power, and sustain domestic stability will disappear in the 2030s when the financial strain becomes absolute. Xi Jinping and the Politburo know this. Their demographic collapse creates an enormous incentive for aggressive action now before the workforce decline makes such ambitions fiscally and militarily impossible. This is the most dangerous element of China's demographic reality, creating instability not just within Asia, but across the globe. The combined force of the shrinking labor pool, the failing pension system, and the collapsing domestic consumer base guarantees that China's rise will be followed by a great contraction, a prolonged period of economic stagnation that will shatter the global economic balance and introduce unprecedented instability into the Asia-Pacific region. Chapter 3. The global economic fallout. Inflation, debt, and the New World Order. The simultaneous decline of the world's 3 most powerful productive nations, Japan, Germany, and China, is not a localized problem. It guarantees a global economic fallout characterized by 3 unavoidable consequences: secular inflation, hyperaccumulation of sovereign debt, and the fragmentation of the global supply chain. This is the moment the demographic time bomb becomes a global economic certainty. 1. The death of deflation, the permanent inflation shock. For the last 30 years, the global economy was dominated by a powerful deflationary force known simply as the China price. China's massive, cheap labor pool flooded the world with inexpensive manufactured goods, holding down prices everywhere from Walmart to the industrial sector. This force counteracted money printing and other inflationary pressures in the West. The productivity loss. As the workforces of Japan, Germany, and China shrink, the global supply of manufactured goods will inevitably fall, while the cost of producing them, due to rising wages and labor scarcity, will dramatically increase. The marginal cost of production is permanently rising. The secular inflation. This structural loss of productive labor guarantees secular inflation, a permanent underlying inflationary pressure that cannot be easily tamed by central banks. The high labor costs in Europe, Germany, and the manufacturing exodus from Asia, China, mean that the era of cheap, easily scalable global goods is permanently over. Supply-side inflation will be the permanent reality for the next 2 decades, pushing consumer prices higher regardless of demand. Central bank failure. Central banks are historically accustomed to fighting inflation caused by demand, too much money chasing too few goods, solvable with interest rate hikes. They are ill-equipped to fight inflation caused by structural supply collapse, too few workers producing the goods. Hiking interest rates to fight demographic-driven inflation risks crushing demand and causing a recession without fixing the underlying supply problem, leading directly to stagflation, low growth coupled with high inflation, on a global scale mirroring the 1970s, but without the benefit of a young workforce. 2. The debt vortex, the fiscal impossibility. The inverse pyramid structure of these aging nations makes their financial systems fundamentally unsustainable. The demographic structure guarantees irreversible sovereign debt growth as a matter of fiscal policy necessity. The dependency ratio drain. The core problem is the spiking old age dependency ratio, the ratio of elderly dependents to working age people. As this ratio spikes in Japan, Germany, and China, the government is forced into a fiscal death spiral that has only one short-term solution: debt. Decreasing revenue. The shrinking tax base, fewer workers means fewer income and consumption taxes, guarantees falling revenue, increasing expense, The increasing number of pensioners guarantees rising mandatory expenses, Social Security, healthcare, elder care subsidies. The inevitable debt. To bridge this growing and structural fiscal gap, governments must borrow. This debt is not for infrastructure or productive growth. It is demographic debt, accumulated purely to cover the simple fixed cost of the social contract signed 50 years ago. Japan's 260% debt to GDP ratio is the consequence of this unavoidable reality. Germany and China are rapidly approaching the same fiscal impossibility, shattering the reputation of German fiscal prudence and Chinese state control. The global risk, the collapse of the German and Japanese bond markets, or the implosion of China's local government debt, which covers its essential social services, would send profound shockwaves through the global financial system. Given the interconnected nature of global finance, this level of simultaneous sovereign stress would far exceed the localized stress caused by the 2008 banking crisis, threatening the stability of the euro and the global trade financing system. 3. Supply chain. Fragmentation, the new geopolitical Cold War. The demographic decline ensures that the era of a single, centralized global manufacturing hub, China, is over. This guarantees the rise of regionalized, fractured supply chains based strictly on labor availability and geopolitical security. Manufacturing shift, production will rapidly move from the contracting labor pools of China to the young nations. With burgeoning workforces, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, and key nations in Africa. This is an economic shift dictated by the mathematics of labor cost and availability, not politics. The new Cold War, labor. The United States and Europe will be forced to compete for labor, capital, and resources with each other and with a contracting China to ensure their economic continuity. Geopolitics will shift from competition over physical resources, oil, to competition over young, productive workers and secure, diversified supply chains, decoupling acceleration. The demographic imperative to move production out of China will accelerate the existing geopolitical trend toward decoupling and friendshoring. This makes global trade less efficient, more expensive, and far more prone to inflationary and supply shocks, as efficiency is sacrificed for resilience and political security. The combined force of these demographic realities means that the next decade will be defined by scarcity. Scarcity of labor, scarcity of cheap goods, and scarcity of fiscal stability in the world's most historically reliable and productive nations. This era of secular stagnation and inflation guarantees the final dissolution of the post-Cold War global economic order, replacing it with a more volatile multipolar system. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Escape, Failed Policy. Responses. Faced with an existential demographic threat, Japan, Germany, and China have pursued every possible policy response to escape the irreversible pattern. The consistent universal failure of these efforts proves that once a nation is trapped in stage 3, the demographic math becomes unassailable. Political will and financial incentives can influence individual decisions, but they cannot overcome the structural inertia of modern society. The core policy solutions fall into 3 main buckets: financial engineering, fertility incentives, and immigration. Each has proven insufficient in the face of the overwhelming scale of the demographic deficit. 1. Financial engineering, the failed Japanese blueprint. Japan, having been in stage 4 for 2 decades, perfected the art of using financial engineering to mask a demographic problem. Quantitative easing, QE, and zero rates, the Bank of Japan, BOJ, pioneered massive QE, keeping interest rates near zero for decades. The goal was to combat deflation and stimulate demand. The reality is that zero interest rates are a necessary palliative in a shrinking economy. When the population and the workforce are shrinking, demand naturally contracts. QE does not create new young workers. It merely transfers wealth and inflates asset prices without fixing the underlying problem. Debt monetization. Japan's central government debt, over 260% of GDP, is largely held by the BOJ and domestic institutions. This debt monetization allows the government to fund its massive social security payments. This is not fiscal stability, it is the printing of demographic debt, a process that transfers the cost to the next generation through currency debasement and inflation risk. The global contagion. The failure of this model is not that it didn't solve the problem, it simply bought time. But this time has now run out. The reliance on financial engineering only accelerates the inevitable collapse by increasing the final debt burden. This blueprint is now being copied, with less success, by Europe and in a more disguised manner by China, guaranteeing a synchronous global fiscal strain. 2. Fertility incentives, throwing money at a social problem. Both Germany and, more recently and desperately, China have attempted to use massive financial incentives to convince young couples to have more children. This approach universally fails for the same reasons. The cost of time. The primary reason for low birth rates in advanced economies is not the cost of having a child, but the opportunity cost to the mother's career, education, and personal time. Subsidies, tax breaks, and even cash payments cannot compensate for the permanent loss of career advancement or the desire for personal liberty. The German experience. Germany has some of the world's most generous family policies, extensive parental leave, high child benefits, Kindergeld, and subsidized daycare. Yet, the German fertility rate remains stubbornly low, hovering around 1.5. These policies slowed the decline but failed to cross the critical 2.1 replacement rate threshold. The Chinese panic. After ending the one-child policy, China's birth rates plunged further, shocking the government. Incentives offered by local and central governments, cash rewards, housing subsidies, and extended parental leave have had almost no discernible effect. Young Chinese couples facing intense housing costs, brutal 996 work culture, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, and historical social trauma from the one-child policy have universally rejected the state's plea for more children. The cost of living and the pressure on the workforce are stronger than any subsidy. Fertility incentives are a political gesture, a refusal to accept demographic reality, not a scalable solution. Once the social contract shifts away from large families, it is impossible to rebuild that preference through cash. 3. Immigration. The limited band-aid. Immigration is the only viable, immediate tool for offsetting workforce decline, and Germany has pursued it most aggressively. However, it too faces mathematical and political limits. The German experiment. Germany has accepted millions of migrants over the last decade. This provided a crucial temporary influx of young workers and stabilized the overall population size. However, the sheer scale of the demographic deficit is too large. To truly fix the problem, Germany would need a net inflow of several 100,000 young skilled immigrants every single year for the next 3 decades. A political and logistical challenge that strains infrastructure, social cohesion, and the political system. The Japanese and Chinese resistance. Both Japan and China have resisted large-scale immigration due to deep cultural, linguistic, and historical preferences for ethnic homogeneity. Japan has been forced to open its doors slightly for highly skilled workers, but remains fundamentally closed to the necessary volume of low-skilled immigration needed for its service and elder care sectors. China's state control makes mass immigration impossible and undesirable for the Communist Party. The time limit. Immigrants eventually age. Unless the receiving country has a domestic fertility rate near the replacement level, which none of these 3 do, or the immigration rate increases exponentially every decade, the fundamental problem of the reverse pyramid eventually reappears. Immigration is a band-aid, not a cure, and it carries its own significant social and political costs. The universal failure of these 3 policy pillars confirms the central thesis. The demographic pattern is irreversible. Japan, Germany, and China are trapped in a scenario where the only way out requires solutions. Chapter 5. The guarantees of the New World Order. The simultaneous, irreversible decline of the world's 3 most powerful productive nations, Japan, Germany, and China, is the guarantee of a new, volatile world order. This new order will be defined not by the collapse of a single superpower, but by the synchronous weakness of the entire global economic foundation. The world will shift from the current unipolar or bipolar model, US versus China, to a multipolar fragility built on 3 guaranteed outcomes. 1. The de-Westernization of global production. The core consequence of the demographic crisis is the irreversible shift of global manufacturing and supply chains out of the control of the aging G7 in China and into the control of the young nations. The labor exodus. Capital will chase cheap labor, full stop. The primary recipients of this investment will be India, Indonesia, Mexico, Vietnam, and key nations in Africa, e.g. Nigeria, Egypt. These nations possess the young, growing workforces necessary for the next generation of global manufacturing. The Indian century. India, with its massive young population and high fertility rates, is uniquely positioned to inherit the demographic dividend that China has forfeited. The fiscal burden of India's social system is low, and its workforce is expanding, making it the unavoidable center of gravity for the 21st century's manufacturing and consumption. The loss of control. The West, US, Germany, Japan, will lose control over global production. Their economic future will depend on geopolitical stability and trade access with these new manufacturing hubs. This loss of economic leverage guarantees a decline in political influence and a shift of wealth and power away from the Atlantic and Pacific rims. 2. The dominance of inflation and fiscal stress. The demographic guarantees ensure that the key macroeconomic challenge for the developed world will be secular inflation and sovereign debt management. The age of easy money will be replaced by the age of impossible choices. The end of the China deflator. Central banks can no longer rely on cheap Asian goods to mask money printing and domestic wage inflation. The The primary policy tool will shift to wage and price controls, or politically catastrophic levels of interest rates, neither of which is tenable in a democracy. The great consolidation, the fiscal stress from supporting aging populations, will force governments in Germany and Japan into desperate measures. We will see accelerated privatization of state assets and massive inflationary money printing as the final resort to cover pension liabilities. The debt will be erased, but at the cost of the currency's purchasing power, effectively transferring wealth from younger savers to older pensioners. The rise of hard assets, the guaranteed debasement of currency in all three major economic blocs. Europe, Japan, China, due to their fiscal impossibility, will drive capital into scarce, non-fiat assets, physical gold, productive land, and potentially decentralized digital currencies like Bitcoin. The demographic collapse guarantees the ascendancy of hard assets as the only reliable store of value. 3. The guaranteed geopolitical volatility. The structural decline of these major powers guarantees a period of maximum geopolitical volatility as the old order attempts to manage its decline and the rising powers assert their new roles. China's risk window. The most immediate danger is China, whose demographic and economic decline is now locked in. This closing window of opportunity creates an incentive for preemptive military action, e.g., Taiwan, before the nation's economic base can no longer support a major conflict. The demographic clock is the ultimate constraint on the Politburo's ambitions. European fragmentation, the collapse of Germany's fiscal stability will inevitably weaken the euro, reigniting the sovereign debt crises of the Mediterranean states. This fiscal stress, coupled with ongoing immigration debates, guarantees the political and economic fragmentation of the European Union, removing it as a major global political force. American choice. The U.S., while facing its own demographic challenges, is relatively better positioned due to higher fertility and robust immigration. The U.S. will be forced to choose between two paths: isolationism, abandoning the collapsing blocs and focusing solely on domestic strength, or strategic rebuilding, investing heavily in the young nations like Mexico and India to secure new, resilient supply chains and build new alliances. The demographic collapse is not just an economic headwind, it is the fundamental guarantee of a new world order. It is a certainty that cannot be debated, only observed. The decline of the productive giants is locked in, and the consequences will define the next 50 years of human history.